The storm had been raging for 2 hours when Dan Harrison heard the soft knocking at his front door. Thunder rolled across the Tennessee hills like an old friend sharing secrets, and the rain fell in sheets that turned his modest front porch into a waterfall. At 45, Dan had learned to be cautious about unexpected visitors. 3 years of struggling to rebuild his life after losing his construction business had taught him that surprises rarely brought good news. But when he opened the door, his carpenter's hands still rough from the day's work, he found something that touched the deepest part of his heart. A woman stood there, soaked to the bone, her auburn hair plastered against her face. Her white blouse was torn at the shoulder, and even in the dim porch light, Dan could see the purple bruise blooming across her left cheek. She was shivering, not just from the cold, but from something much deeper. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I'm sorry to bother you, but could I just stand on your porch until the rain stops? I saw your light and—" Dan didn't hesitate. "Ma'am, you're hurt. Come inside. Please." He stepped back, opening the door wider, and she hesitated for just a moment before stepping into the warmth of his small living room. The house was modest but clean, with handmade furniture that spoke of careful craftsmanship and a father's love. School photos of a teenage girl smiled from the mantel above a stone fireplace. "Sarah," Dan called softly up the stairs, "could you bring down some of those clothes from the donation box and maybe start some tea?" Within minutes, his 16-year-old daughter appeared with an armload of women's clothing, her eyes wide with concern but asking no questions. Dan had raised her well. She understood that sometimes people needed help first and explanations later. "There's a bathroom down the hall," Dan said gently. "Take all the time you need. We'll be right here when you're ready." As the woman disappeared down the hallway, Sarah whispered to her father, "Dad, should we call someone? The police?" Dan shook his head slowly. "Let's see what she needs first, sweetheart. Sometimes people just need a safe place to catch their breath." 20 minutes later, she emerged wearing Sarah's old jeans and a soft sweater, her hair towel-dried and hanging loose around her shoulders. Without the expensive clothes and perfect makeup, she looked different, younger somehow, more human. "Thank you," she said, settling carefully into the chair Dan offered. "I'm Victoria. I don't really know where to begin." "You don't have to begin anywhere you're not ready for," Dan replied, his voice carrying the same gentle patience he'd learned from years of coaxing his daughter through difficult conversations. "Would you like some soup? Sarah makes a mean chicken and dumpling recipe she learned from her grandmother." As the evening unfolded, Victoria found herself sharing pieces of a story she'd never told anyone. Not the polished version she'd presented to boards and investors, but the real one. The one about growing up poor, clawing her way to success, and somewhere along the way forgetting the difference between strength and hardness. About a marriage that had slowly turned from cold to cruel, and a man who saw her success as a personal affront that needed correcting. "I left tonight," she said, her hands wrapped around the warm mug of tea. "Just walked out in the middle of the storm. I couldn't stay another day." Dan listened without judgment, the way his own father had once listened to his troubles. Outside, the storm continued its wild dance, but inside the small house, something quiet and healing was taking place. "You can stay here tonight," Dan offered. "The couch pulls out into a bed. Tomorrow, when you've had some rest, we can figure out what comes next." It wasn't until the third day, when Victoria was helping Sarah with her college application essays, that Dan discovered who she really was. A business magazine Sarah had been using for a current events project lay open on the kitchen table, and there was Victoria's photo, professional and polished, above an article titled "Sterling Developments, Aggressive Expansion Strategy." Dan stared at the page for a long moment, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Sterling Development. The company that had bought out 3 major contracts from under his small construction business, underbidding him by margins that seemed impossible, until he learned they were using undocumented workers at below minimum wages. The company whose practices had forced him to lay off his crew, sell his equipment, and eventually declare bankruptcy. Victoria Sterling. The woman who had cost him everything now sat at his kitchen table helping his daughter with homework. For waste. 24 hours, Dan carried this knowledge like a stone in his chest. He watched Victoria laugh at Sarah's stories, saw her quietly do dishes when she thought no one was looking, noticed how she flinched whenever a door closed too loudly. This wasn't the cold corporate executive who had destroyed his livelihood. This was a woman who had been broken down to her most essential self, and what remained was surprisingly genuine. On the 4th morning, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold, Dan finally spoke. "I know who you are," he said quietly. Victoria's coffee mug stilled halfway to her lips. "What do you mean?" "Sterling Development. 3 years ago, you bought out the Riverside Shopping Center contract, and the municipal building renovation, and the hospital expansion." Dan's voice was steady, but she could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I lost my business. Had to lay off 12 good people who'd worked for me for years." Victoria set down her mug with shaking hands. "Oh God, Dan, I'm so sorry. I should leave. I should have left the moment I—" "No," Dan said, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. "3 years ago, I hated Victoria Sterling. I used to lie awake at night wondering how someone could be so ruthless, so completely disconnected from the people their decisions affected." He paused, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily above the tree line. "But I don't hate the woman who's been helping my daughter with her homework. I don't hate the woman who insisted on doing all the cooking yesterday because she wanted to contribute something. I don't hate the woman who sat up all night with Sarah when she had that panic attack about her college interview." Victoria was crying now, tears falling silently onto her hands. "I made terrible choices," she whispered. "I told myself I was being smart, being competitive. I never let myself think about the people behind the numbers." Dan nodded slowly. "I spent 2 years angry about what you took from me, but sitting here now I realized something. Maybe what happened needed to happen. Maybe I was so focused on building my business bigger and faster that I forgot why I started it in the first place, to create something meaningful, something that would make my community better." He gestured toward the workshop behind the house, where the warm glow of work lights could be seen through the windows. "Now I make custom furniture. I teach woodworking to kids at the community center. I'm home when Sarah needs me. I make less money, but I sleep better at night. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what actually matters." Victoria looked at him with something close to wonder. "How can you forgive me? How can you even stand to have me in your house?" Dan was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "My wife died when Sarah was 8, he said finally. "Cancer. During those last months, she taught me something important. She said that carrying anger is like holding a hot coal. It burns you more than the person you want to throw it at. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing not to let the past poison whatever good might come next." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the morning sky in shades of hope. Victoria would stay for 2 more weeks, helping Sarah with college applications and slowly finding her strength again. She would eventually testify against her ex-husband, helping to put him in prison for domestic assault. She would also liquidate her remaining assets and establish a foundation to support small businesses affected by corporate displacement. Starting with a grant that helped Dan expand his woodworking program to include job training for unemployed construction workers. But perhaps most importantly, she would learn that redemption doesn't come from grand gestures or public apologies. It comes from the quiet daily choice to be better than you were yesterday, to see the humanity in others, and to accept the grace that sometimes arrives disguised as a stormy night and an unlocked door. As Dan would later tell his daughter, life has a way of bringing us exactly the lessons we need, exactly when we're ready to receive them. The trick is keeping your heart open enough to recognize grace when it comes knocking.